There are places in America where power isn't earned, it's taken. Where a badge doesn't represent justice, it represents terror. Millbrook, Georgia, was one of those places. For nearly a decade, Sheriff Ronald Smith had ruled the small town like a personal kingdom, his uniform a license to humiliate, his word the only law that mattered. He had brutalized teenagers for talking back, destroyed small businesses on a whim, and made it clear that certain people would never be welcome in his town. But on a scorching September morning, Sheriff Smith made a miscalculation that would shatter his empire. When he grabbed 68-year-old Catherine Carlock by the arm and dragged her out of Lou's family diner for the crime of sitting too long over breakfast, he thought he was just putting another uppity woman in her place. He thought the frightened witnesses would stay silent like they always did. He thought the bruises he left on her wrists would fade into the background noise of a town too scared to fight back. What Sheriff Ronald Smith didn't know, what he couldn't have known because Catherine Carlock was too humble to ever mention it, was that the quiet, dignified woman he'd just assaulted had raised a son who now sat in a secured office in the Pentagon. A son who advised generals. A son whose security clearance was higher than most senators would ever see. A son who was, at that very moment, driving through Georgia with a bouquet of flowers in the passenger seat on his way to surprise his mother for her birthday. Victor Carlock wasn't just coming home for cake, he was about to walk into a nightmare. And Sheriff Ronald Smith was about to discover that some mothers don't need to fight their own battles. They raised someone who would burn the whole system down to protect them. Millbrook, Georgia sat in the pine forests of southeast Georgia like a secret that nobody wanted to tell. Population 4,200. One main street, 3 churches, a grocery store that closed at 6, a gas station that doubled as the social hub for men who had nothing better to do than complain about the government while cashing disability checks. It was the kind of town that people left and never came back to, where ambition went to die, and where the past clung to the present like kudzu on a fence post. The town had been incorporated in 1887, founded by a handful of farming families whose names still appeared on street signs, on the dedication plaques of park benches, and on the brass nameplates of pews in the 3 churches that anchored the community. There was a founding mythology about Millbrook, one of hard-working pioneers and Christian values and neighborly love, that was told and retold at 4th of July celebrations and high school graduation speeches. Like most founding mythologies, it was about 40% true and 60% wishful revision. The parts that got left out were the parts that always got left out in such tellings. By the time Ronald Smith took the sheriff's badge, Millbrook had been hollowing out for 20 years. The textile mill that had once employed half the town closed in 2001. The GM dealership shuttered in 2009. The hospital had been downgraded to an urgent care clinic in 2014, meaning anyone with a real medical emergency had to make a 40-minute drive to Albany. Young people left for college and didn't come back because there was nothing to come back to. The ones who stayed were the ones who couldn't leave, because of family, because of roots, because of resources, or because the wider world had made it clear in one way or another that it didn't particularly want them. Into this vacuum of institutional decline, Ronald Smith had inserted himself with the confidence of a man who understood one fundamental truth about power. It flows toward whoever is willing to take it. Lou's family diner occupied a tired brick building on the corner of Main and Hutchinson, a relic from the 1970s that smelled permanently of bacon grease, coffee, and the particular sadness of a place that had seen better days and knew they weren't coming back. The booths were cracked red vinyl, patched with duct tape. The floors were scuffed linoleum that had once been white. The ceiling tiles were stained brown from decades of cigarette smoke, back when smoking indoors was still legal. But Lou's served the best biscuits in 3 counties, and that was enough to keep people coming back. Lou himself, Lou Beaumont, 60 years old, with the leathery skin of a man who'd spent his 20s working outside and his 30s and 40s working inside over a hot stove, had owned the diner for 30 years. He'd bought it from the original owner, a woman named Patrice Dubois, who'd started it in 1971 and run it until her knees gave out. Lou had kept the name because changing it felt like erasing something that didn't belong to him. He'd kept the recipes too. Lou was not a brave man. He knew that about himself and didn't particularly hide from it. He'd grown up poor in this county, had learned young that the way to survive was to stay small and keep your head down. And those lessons had calcified into habit over the decades. He'd watched Ronald Smith do things in his diner that turned his stomach. He'd stayed quiet. He told himself it was because he had employees to protect, a business to keep open, a mortgage on the building he'd never quite managed to pay off. Sometimes, in the dark part of the night, he admitted to himself that those were excuses, that he was simply afraid. On September 12th, a Thursday morning that had dawned humid and oppressive, Catherine Carlock sat in her usual booth near the window, the one that gave her a view of the street and the Presbyterian church across the way. She was a small woman, just 5'2", with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, on skin the color of polished mahogany, and hands that showed every one of her 68 years, hands that had scrubbed floors, changed diapers, cooked 10,000 meals, and held her husband's hand as he died of cancer 4 years ago. She wore a simple floral dress, sensible shoes, and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. On the table in front of her sat a half-finished plate of scrambled eggs and grits, a cup of black coffee that had gone lukewarm, and a well-worn paperback, Toni Morrison's Beloved, which she was reading for the 3rd time. Catherine came to Lou's every Thursday morning. It was her ritual. After her husband Thomas passed, the house had become too quiet, too full of memories that hurt more than they comforted. She'd tried different things to fill the silence. She'd volunteered more at the church, but the evenings were still long. She'd started a garden, and it helped, but it had seasons, and winter came. So she came here, to the diner, where there were voices and life, and the comfortable anonymity of being around people without having to perform for them. She had been sitting in that booth for 45 minutes. She had paid for her meal 30 minutes ago. She was just finishing her coffee and her chapter, taking her time, because where else did she have to be? There were things Catherine Carlock thought about on those Thursday mornings, things she turned over quietly in her mind while the town moved around her. She thought about Thomas, naturally, about the way he'd taken his coffee, 2 sugars and cream so light it barely changed the color, about the sound of him singing off-key to the radio on Saturday mornings, about the fact that she still sometimes woke up in the middle of the night and reached for him before remembering. She thought about Victor, worried about him the way mothers worry about their children, regardless of how capable those children become, wondering if he was eating properly, if he was sleeping, if the weight of the work he did, work she didn't fully understand and suspected she wasn't cleared to understand, was grinding him down in ways he wouldn't admit. She thought about the town, about what it had been when she was young and what it had become. She had a complicated relationship with Millbrook, in the way that you can have a complicated relationship with anything that has both sheltered you and wounded you, that is both home and cage. She'd grown up here, gone to the school here, met Thomas here, raised Victor here. She'd buried parents and friends, and eventually Thomas from the same church she'd been baptized in. The town was woven into the fabric of who she was in ways that couldn't be separated without tearing something essential. But she'd also spent 68 years navigating the particular arithmetic of being a black woman in a small Georgia town, the constant calculation of how much space she was allowed to take up, how loud she was allowed to be, how much dignity she could assert before it became threatening to someone. That arithmetic had changed over the decades, gotten somewhat more generous, but it hadn't disappeared. Ronald Smith had made sure of that, The bell above the diner door didn't jingle when Sheriff Ronald Smith entered. It clanged, violent and sharp, like a warning shot. The temperature in the room dropped. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Even Lou, the owner, a grizzled 60-year-old white man who'd run the diner for 30 years, went still behind the counter. Ronald Smith was 6'3" and 280 pounds of mean. He had the build of a man who'd been an athlete in high school and had spent the decade since turning muscle into fat and rage. His uniform was always immaculate, pressed sharp, boots polished to a mirror shine, badge gleaming, because appearance was control, and control was everything. He wore mirrored sunglasses even indoors, because he liked that people couldn't see his eyes, couldn't read him, couldn't predict him. He was 46 years old. He had been sheriff of Millbrook for 9 years, elected in a race where he'd run unopposed after his predecessor mysteriously decided not to seek re-election following a series of anonymous but very detailed allegations about his personal life. Allegations that had been investigated by Ronald Smith himself. Smith had grown up in Millbrook, too, in a double-wide on the east side of town, with a father who drank and a mother who prayed, and neither of whom had been particularly useful to him as a child. What he'd had, from the time he was very young, was a need to be in control that was so deep and so constant, it felt like hunger. In high school, he'd been a linebacker and a bully, and those things had felt, at the time, like the same thing. He'd been good at football, good enough to get a partial scholarship to a state school, or not good enough to get the full ride or the NFL dreams some of his coaches had, carefully, kindly, warned him against. He'd come back to Millbrook after 2.5 years of college, no degree, no prospects, and a simmering resentment toward everyone who'd done better than him, which was most people. He'd become a deputy at 25, made sergeant at 30, had his eye on the sheriff's office from his first day in uniform, understanding instinctively that in a town like Millbrook, that office was the only throne available, and he was the only one with enough appetite to take it. Smith didn't walk into the diner. He prowled. His eyes swept the room from behind those mirrored lenses, cataloging, assessing, looking for problems, looking for opportunities. His gaze landed on Catherine Carlock. She didn't notice him at first. She was absorbed in her book, her coffee cup lifted halfway to her lips, her expression serene. That serenity enraged him. He couldn't have explained why, not articulately, but it had something to do with the way she looked entirely unbothered, comfortable, at peace, occupying her corner of the diner as though she had every right to be there, as though the space were hers. Smith had a particular sensitivity to that kind of ease. It read to him as defiance, as a refusal to acknowledge the hierarchy he'd spent 9 years establishing. Everybody in this town was supposed to tense up when he walked in. Everybody was supposed to feel, on some level, watched and weighed and possibly found wanting. This old woman sitting there reading her book like she was in her own living room. It felt like an insult. Smith walked toward her booth, his boots heavy on the linoleum, each step deliberate. He stopped at the edge of her table and stood there, looming, waiting for her to acknowledge him. Catherine finished her sentence, marked her place with a receipt, and looked up. When she saw Sheriff Smith, something flickered across her face. Not fear, exactly, but a weary recognition. She knew what this was. She'd seen it before. Men like Ronald Smith had been part of her landscape for 68 years. "Morning, Sheriff," Catherine said, her voice quiet and polite, the voice of a woman who had learned long ago that politeness was armor. "You've been here a while," Smith said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "Yes, sir. Just finishing my coffee." She gestured to the cup. "You paid yet?" "Yes, sir. I paid Lou about half an hour ago." She glanced toward the counter, where Lou stood frozen, his face pale. Smith didn't look at Lou. He kept his eyes on Catherine. We got ordinances in this town about loitering. Can't have people taking up space all morning when paying customers need seats. Catherine looked around the diner. There were 14 empty tables. The morning rush, such as it was in Millbrook, had ended an hour ago. There were exactly 5 other people in the restaurant, none of them waiting for a table. I wasn't aware I was causing a problem, Sheriff, Catherine said carefully. I'm telling you, you're causing a problem, Smith said, his voice rising just enough to carry to every corner of the diner. This is a business establishment, not a public library. You want to sit and read, go to your own house. Lou finally found his voice. No, Sheriff, Mrs. Carlock is a regular customer. She's not bothering anyone. Did I ask you? Smith whipped his head toward Lou, and the diner owner actually took a step back. I'll decide who's bothering who in my town. His town. That's how he thought of it. That's how he'd always thought of it. Smith turned back to Catherine. I'm going to need you to leave. Now. Catherine's hands, resting on the table, began to tremble slightly. Not from fear, from anger that she'd spent a lifetime learning to suppress. She had been asked to leave spaces before. She had been made to feel unwelcome before. Each time she had breathed through it, reminded herself of who she was, told herself the opinion of a small man was not the measure of her worth. She was doing that now, running that internal calculus. I'll finish my coffee and go, Sheriff, in 2 more minutes. No. Smith reached down and grabbed her by the upper arm, his large hand wrapping entirely around her thin bicep. I said now. The grip was painfully tight. Catherine gasped. Sheriff, please, she started. Don't please me, Smith snarled. He yanked her out of the booth. Catherine was not a large woman. The sudden violence of the motion sent her stumbling forward. Her knee hit the edge of the table. Her coffee cup tipped over, sending cold coffee spreading across the surface and dripping onto the floor. Her book fell, pages splaying. Sheriff, Lou shouted. Stop it! You're hurting her! Smith ignored him. He had Catherine by both arms now, his fingers digging into her flesh, hard enough to leave marks. He marched her toward the door, her feet barely keeping up, her sensible shoes scraping against the linoleum. You think you can ignore me? Smith hissed into her ear, loud enough for everyone to hear. You think because you're some old church lady you don't have to listen? I'm the law here. When I say move, you move. Catherine didn't respond. She couldn't. The pain in her arms was radiating up into her shoulders. Her heart was hammering. She was trying not to cry, trying not to give him the satisfaction. She thought, briefly, and with absolute clarity, of Thomas. Of what Thomas would have done had he been there. He had been a gentle man, so gentle it had surprised people who expected something different from a man who stood 6 feet tall and worked construction. But there was a line, and she'd seen him cross it exactly once, at a gas station in 1987, when a man had grabbed her wrist. Thomas had been calm, and very still, and very certain, and the man had let go. She thought of Victor. She thought, don't call him. Don't involve him. He has his own life, his own world, his own burdens. This is not his fight. She thought those things, even as Smith shoved her out the door. Catherine stumbled out onto the sidewalk, catching herself against a parking meter. Behind her, the door swung shut. She stood there in the morning heat, breathing hard, her arms throbbing. She looked at her wrists. Dark red marks were already forming. Fingerprints, 5 on each arm, soon to be bruises. Inside the diner, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They had all just witnessed an assault, and every single one of them knew that if they said anything, if they did anything, they would be next. Except for one person. Lou's youngest waitress, a 22-year-old named Emma Bledsoe. None had been standing near the kitchen door when it happened. She had her phone in her apron pocket. And she had pressed record. Emma stood very still after the door closed, watching through the window as Mrs. Carlock steadied herself against the parking meter. She watched the older woman take 3 careful breaths. She could see her shoulders rise and fall. She watched her smooth the front of her dress. She watched her pick up her dignity like a dropped item and settle it back around herself. Emma's hands were shaking. She'd grown up in Millbrook. She'd been watching Ronald Smith run this town her whole life. She'd seen him pull over her older brother 4 times in 1 year, for reasons that got vague and inconsistent whenever her brother asked. She'd seen him stand in front of businesses and talk to the owners in that particular low, pleasant voice that meant the conversation was not actually pleasant. She'd watched people leave town or go quiet or simply bend. She looked down at her phone, looked at the video she'd just recorded. She was 22 years old. She worked at a diner for $11 an hour. She did not have connections. She did not have resources. She did not have a plan. What she had was a video, a bone-deep sense of wrong, and the phone number from the emergency contact card that Mrs. Carlock kept in her purse, which she'd left behind in the confusion. The card said, in neat handwriting, Victor Carlock, son, in case of emergency. Emma had a feeling this qualified. 340 miles away, on Interstate 16 heading east, Victor Carlock was making excellent time. He had left Washington, D.C. at 4:30 that morning, on driving through the dark, fueled by gas station coffee and the particular anticipation that comes with surprising someone you love. His mother's 69th birthday was tomorrow, Friday the 13th, a date she'd always joked about, saying she was born under a lucky curse. Victor had told her he couldn't make it home this year, that work was too demanding, that he'd send a card and call. It was a lie. He'd been planning this for weeks. Getting the time off had required maneuvering. He'd been in the middle of a sensitive policy review cycle, and the timing was poor, and his deputy director had raised an eyebrow when he'd submitted the leave request. But Victor had accumulated 3 months of unused leave over the past 5 years because he never went anywhere, never did anything that didn't orbit the job in some way. A long weekend to see his mother was. His deputy director had finally agreed. Not an unreasonable expenditure of that accumulated time. Victor Carlock was 42 years old, though most people who met him professionally assumed he was older. He carried himself with the kind of authority that aged him in the eyes of others. He was 6 feet tall, lean in the way of a man who ran every morning without fail, with close cropped hair that was just starting to gray at the temples, and a face that his mother had always said was serious but kind. He'd inherited her eyes, deep-set, steady, the kind that made people feel simultaneously seen and uncertain about what had been observed. He wore civilian clothes today, dark jeans, a gray button-down shirt, leather jacket in the passenger seat. No tie, no Pentagon credentials visible. He had learned long ago that home and work existed in separate worlds, and he tried to keep it that way. His job title, when he bothered to explain it to people outside the cleared community, was Senior Policy Advisor, Office of the Secretary of Defense. That was the unclassified version. The actual job was considerably more specific and considerably more sensitive. Victor advised on matters of critical infrastructure protection, cybersecurity policy at the strategic level, and coordination between DoD and the intelligence community on threats that most Americans would never hear about, and should probably never hear about. He'd come to the work sideways, an electrical engineering degree from Georgia Tech, a master's in public policy from Georgetown, a stint at NSA that had been transformative in ways he was still, years later, processing. He'd discovered somewhere in that journey that he had a particular talent for understanding how systems failed, not just technological systems, but human ones, institutional ones, how power organized itself, how accountability collapsed, how the gaps between what institutions said they were and what they actually were became the spaces where damage was done. He held a top-secret/SCI clearance. He had testified before closed congressional committees. He had been in the room when decisions were made that would be classified for the next 50 years. But today, driving through rural Georgia with a bouquet of flowers in the passenger seat and a birthday cake secured in the back, chocolate with buttercream frosting, her favorite, from a bakery near his apartment in D.C., that his mother would have found unnecessarily fancy. He wasn't a Pentagon official. He was just a son going home to see his mama. He'd been thinking, as he drove, about what home meant to him now. It was a question he turned over occasionally, when the work slowed enough to let him think in longer arcs. He'd left Millbrook at 18 and hadn't really gone back, not in any complete sense. He'd returned for holidays, for his father's illness, for the funeral. He'd returned for Christmas 2 years ago, the visit that had been short and strange, where he'd walked the streets of the town he'd grown up in and felt like a tourist in a country he'd once belonged to. He'd stood in Lou's diner and eaten biscuits and felt the way the room changed when Smith walked in and had said nothing, because what was there to say? Since the man hadn't done anything that day. He'd just walked in and owned the room and walked out. Victor had driven back to Atlanta afterward with a feeling he'd identified, after some reflection, as guilt. He'd left his mother in a town governed by that man. He'd built his life in Washington and left her here, and he'd told himself it was her choice, which it was, and that he respected her autonomy, which he did. But under all that was something simpler and harder. He hadn't wanted to look too closely at what she was living with, because looking too closely would have required him to do something about it. His phone, mounted on the dashboard, showed 2:47 p.m. ETA to Millbrook, 34 minutes. His phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number with a Georgia area code. Victor glanced at it. The preview said, "Mr. Carlock? This is Emma from Lou's Diner. It's about your mother." His stomach dropped. He pulled over immediately, hazard lights on, and opened the message. The full text read, "Mr. Carlock? This is Emma from Lou's Diner in Millbrook. I got your number from your mom's phone contact list. She left her purse here. Sheriff Smith heard her this morning, dragged her out of the diner. She's okay, but she's shaken up. She's at home now. She doesn't know I'm texting you. I thought you should know. I have video." Victor read it 3 times. Then he opened his phone's favorites and dialed his mother's number. It rang 4 times. 5. 6. "Hello?" Her voice, when she answered, was smaller than usual. Tired. "Mama," Victor said, and even he could hear the edge in his own voice. "It's Victor." A pause. "Baby? I thought you were in Washington. What's wrong? What happened at the diner this morning?" Another pause, longer this time. He could hear her breathing. He knew that pause. It was the pause she'd always done when he was a boy, and had asked a question she'd rather not answer. Long enough to tell him she was deciding not how to answer, but whether to answer, which told him that the answer existed and was significant. "Mama, what happened?" "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just a misunderstanding with the sheriff. You know how small-town folks can be. I'm fine. Emma texted me. She said he hurt you. Emma shouldn't have done that." There was a tremor in her voice now, anger mixed with something else. Shame? Fear? Both, he suspected. She was ashamed that he was seeing this, ashamed that the town had finally reached out and grabbed her in a way that couldn't be minimized, and she was afraid of what he would do. "It's handled. I'm fine. I don't want you worrying about—" "I'm 20 minutes away," Victor said. Silence. "Mama? You're—" "What?" "I'm 20 minutes outside of Millbrook. I was coming to surprise you for your birthday. I'm pulling back onto the highway now. I'll be there soon. Don't go anywhere. We're going to talk about this." "Victor, baby, you don't need to." "Yes," Victor said quietly. "I do." He hung up before she could argue. Then he opened the text from Emma and typed, "Send me the video. Now." And don't delete it from your phone. Don't show it to anyone else yet. I'll explain when I get there." The video arrived 30 seconds later. Victor pressed play. He watched Sheriff Ronald Smith grab his mother, watched her stumble, watched her try to steady herself, watched her get shoved out the door like trash. He watched it twice. His hands were shaking when he set the phone down. He noticed the shaking with the detached part of his brain that always kept observing, and he recognized it as adrenaline. And he took 3 slow, deliberate breaths, a technique he'd learned years ago for controlling emotional responses in high-pressure situations, borrowed from a debrief with a field officer who'd told him that the goal wasn't to stop feeling. It was to feel without being commanded by the feeling. He felt the anger. He acknowledged it. He breathed through it. Then he put the car in drive, checked his mirrors, and pulled back onto the highway. The flowers were still in the passenger seat. The cake was still in the back. But Victor Carlock was no longer driving home for a birthday party. Victor pulled into his mother's driveway at 3:23 p.m. The house was a small, well-maintained single-story with white siding and forest green shutters. The lawn was immaculate. Catherine paid the neighbor's teenage son to mow it weekly. The garden beds were bursting with late summer flowers, zinnias, black-eyed Susans, marigolds in shades of orange and gold. A wooden porch swing his father had built 20 years ago hung from the eaves, swaying slightly in the breeze. His father had built that swing over a long weekend in late spring, the year Victor turned 16. Victor had helped him, or tried to. Mostly, he'd held pieces in place while Thomas measured and remeasured, a habit his son had inherited without fully realizing it. They'd painted it white to match the shutters, and his father had hung it on a Saturday afternoon. And his mother had brought them both lemonade and sat in the new swing and declared it the finest piece of outdoor furniture in 3 counties. Thomas had grinned like a kid. The swing was still there, still painted white, though it had been repainted more than once, still hanging from the same hardware Thomas had drilled into the eave. Victor stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a moment, looking at it, feeling the weight of what was present and what was absent. He grabbed the flowers but left the cake. He walked up the front path, unlocked the door with the key he'd carried for 24 years, and stepped inside. "Mama?" She emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel, and when she saw him standing in the living room with flowers in his hand, her face crumpled. "Oh, baby," she whispered, and Victor crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into a careful hug, mindful not to grip her arms. She buried her face in his chest and held on. He could feel her shaking slightly. Not sobbing, just trembling. The way you tremble when you've been holding something too long and finally set it down. They stood there for a long moment, mother and son in the quiet house. When she finally pulled back, Victor got his first good look at her face. She looked older than he remembered, and she'd looked older than he remembered at Christmas, too, so that math was getting worse. There were shadows under her eyes. "Let me see your arms," he said gently. "Victor." "Please, Mama." Catherine sighed. She set down the dish towel and slowly rolled up the sleeves of her cardigan. The bruises were spectacular, deep purple and red, finger-shaped, wrapping around both upper arms like cuffs. On her right wrist was a scrape where she'd caught herself against the parking meter, the skin still raw and pink at the edges. Victor looked at them for a long time. His face didn't change. His expression remained carefully neutral. But Catherine had raised him. She knew what that stillness meant. She'd seen it on his father's face, too. That particular stillness that wasn't calm at all, but was rather calm's controlled cousin. The expression of a man who was deciding exactly what to do with something very large that had just entered his hands. "Victor," she said carefully, "don't do something you'll regret." "I'm not going to do anything I'll regret," Victor said. "I promise you that." He took out his phone. "But I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Everything. Don't leave anything out. So she told him. She told him about sitting in the diner, reading her book, bothering no one. She told him about Sheriff Smith coming in, targeting her specifically, even though there were empty tables everywhere. She told him about the accusations of loitering, the refusal to let her finish her coffee, the sudden violence. She was precise in her account. She'd always been precise, a quality she attributed to decades of teaching Sunday school, where a wandering story lost children in 30 seconds flat. "He's done this before," Catherine added quietly. "Not to me specifically, but everyone knows. He targets people. Usually black folks, usually the ones he thinks won't fight back. Last year, he arrested Pastor Williams' nephew for suspicious behavior. The boy was just walking home from basketball practice. A month before that, he shut down Mrs. Chen's restaurant for code violations that mysteriously disappeared once she started paying him monthly consulting fees." "How long?" Victor asked. "The Chen situation was about 3 years ago. The pattern, the one everyone can see but no one talks about, started almost from day one. When he first got elected, there was a period where people thought maybe he'd be different. Maybe he'd be tough but fair. He wasn't. He got worse." Victor was taking notes on his phone. "How long has this been going on?" "Years, ever since he became sheriff. And nobody reports it?" Catherine gave him a look, the same look she'd given him as a teenager when he'd said something particularly naive. It was a look that managed to be simultaneously patient and devastating. "Baby, who would we report it to? He is the law here. Mayor's scared of him. Town council's scared of him. The deputies do what he says or they lose their jobs. And anyone who makes too much noise ends up with their lives turned inside out." "What about the county? The state? The state attorney general?" Maddie Holloway tried, 3 years ago. Filed a complaint with the county because Smith pulled her son over and roughed him up during the stop. County referred it back to the Department for Internal Investigation. Smith cleared himself. Maddie started getting parking tickets on a car that was parked in her own driveway. Her son got stopped 4 more times in 6 months, each time with trumped-up charges that eventually got dropped, but cost them legal fees they couldn't afford. Catherine paused. Maddie moved to Augusta. Her son moved to Atlanta. "That's the pattern," Victor said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Complaint comes in. Person gets ground down until they stop complaining or leave. Classic." "Classic," Catherine agreed, her voice dry. "Not anymore," Victor said. He made 3 phone calls, and they were not the calls a private citizen would make. The first was to Emma at the diner, thanking her for the video and asking if she'd be willing to give a formal statement. There was a brief pause on Emma's end, long enough for Victor to understand that she was doing the same calculation everyone in Millbrook did, the calculation about what resistance cost. And then she said yes, clearly and immediately. He thanked her with a warmth that he meant. The second was to a number in Washington, D.C. that rang in the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Criminal Section. Victor knew the section chief personally. They'd worked together on a joint DOD-DOJ task force 2 years ago. The man was meticulous, thorough, deeply committed to the work in a way that Victor respected without reservation. "Mark, it's Victor Carlock. I need a favor, a personal one." He explained the situation in precise, factual language. The video, the witness accounts his mother had described, the pattern of behavior, the failed internal complaints. He kept his voice level. He did not editorialize. He let the facts do the work they were equipped to do. There was a pause on Mark's end, and then, "Send me the video." Victor did. "Victor," Mark said after a moment, "this is clear as day. This is deprivation of rights under color of law. Textbook. I know. And you said there's a pattern. 9 years of one. Documented and undocumented. I believe if someone starts pulling on the thread, it unravels considerably." "I'll make some calls," Mark said. The third call was to the FBI field office in Albany, Georgia. Victor had met the special agent in charge at an interagency conference in 2021. They'd bonded over a shared frustration with bureaucratic inefficiency and a shared admiration for a particular monograph on institutional failure that not many people had read. He'd sent her a copy afterward. She'd sent him a postcard from her vacation thanking him for ruining it. "Rebecca." "Victor Carlock. I'm calling about a civil rights matter in Millbrook, Georgia. Small-town sheriff. Pattern of abuse. I have video evidence. I need someone to look at this today." Rebecca Harding was not a person who wasted time with expressions of surprise. Today," she repeated, "if possible. I'll send 2 agents this evening. Give me everything you have." He gave her everything. By 5 p.m., the machinery had started moving. By 6 p.m., 2 FBI agents were driving toward Millbrook. By 7 p.m., Sheriff Ronald Smith was about to have the worst night of his life. In the kitchen, Catherine made dinner: roast chicken, collard greens, cornbread, because that was what she did when the world became difficult. She cooked. She had been cooking through difficulty since she was 17 years old, and she was not about to stop now. Victor sat at the kitchen table and worked his phone, tracking the pieces he'd set in motion, while the house filled with the smell of home. They ate together and talked about other things, about his work in the broad strokes he was permitted to share, about the garden, about her church choir's upcoming performance of Handel, about whether she'd watched the documentary he'd sent her a link to 3 weeks ago. She'd found it interesting, but overly impressed with itself. At some point, she laughed at something he said, a real laugh, and he felt a knot loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was there. "Victor," she said finally, when they'd moved to the living room with tea and the remains of his birthday cake, which he'd retrieved from the car and which she'd called unnecessarily fancy, in exactly the way he'd predicted. "Tell me the truth. Can you actually do anything? Or is this," she gestured vaguely, "going to go nowhere like it always does?" Victor was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the screen door, the night had settled in. Crickets, the distant bark of a dog, the particular deep country silence that he'd forgotten in 20 years of city living, could feel like something physical. "I think it's going to go somewhere," he said carefully. "But I want to be honest with you. I'm not certain. Federal civil rights cases take time. Evidence gets contested. Lawyers get involved. There's no guarantee. But you think it's real?" "I think the evidence I've seen tonight is as clear as evidence gets," Victor said. "And I think if the FBI starts pulling this apart, they're going to find more. The question is whether there are enough victims willing to talk." "There will be," Catherine said quietly. "The moment people understand it's the FBI asking, and not Smith's people, there will be." She was right about that. She was right about most things. Sheriff Ronald Smith was having a bourbon at Hal's Tavern when his phone rang. He ignored it at first. He was off duty, or as off duty as a sheriff ever was in a town where he owned everything, and he was enjoying the particular satisfaction that came from knowing he'd put another uppity resident in their place that morning. The Carlock woman. He'd been thinking about her, on and off throughout the day, the way she'd looked up from her book, that composed, careful look that pretended there was nothing to be afraid of. He'd wiped that look off her face. He'd ordered a second bourbon and was contemplating a third when his phone rang. He sighed and checked the screen. Deputy Lewis. "What?" Smith answered, not bothering with pleasantries. "Sheriff, we got a problem." Lewis sounded nervous, which immediately annoyed Smith. Everything made Lewis nervous. The man was 5 years from retirement, and had spent the whole 5 years preceding those 5 years being nervous. "Spit it out. FBI just showed up at the station. 2 agents. They're asking about an incident this morning at Lou's Diner. They want to see you." Smith's hand tightened on his glass. "FBI? What the hell are they doing here?" "They said something about a civil rights investigation. They got a video, Sheriff, of you and that old black lady." The bourbon turned sour in Smith's mouth. "I'll be there in 10 minutes," he said, and hung up. He threw a 20 on the bar and walked out. His mind was racing, sorting through options and explanations the way it had always done when things went sideways. Video. How? Lou didn't have working cameras. Smith had made sure of that years ago, and after the old man had made noises about installing security. Smith had come by and explained, very pleasantly, that a security system might attract unwanted attention from people who had nothing better to do than watch video footage looking for things to complain about. Lou had understood, but Lou wasn't the only one there this morning. Emma, the young waitress, she'd been standing near the kitchen. Smith's jaw clenched so hard his teeth hurt. He pulled into the station parking lot at 7:23 p.m. There were indeed two vehicles he didn't recognize, dark SUVs with government plates. He made note of the plate numbers automatically. A habit. He walked inside. Deputy Lewis, hovering near the entrance, looked like he might throw up. Standing in the lobby were two people in dark suits, a woman in her 40s with severe features and a no-nonsense bearing, and a younger man with the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym. Sheriff Smith. The woman spoke first, not offering her hand. I'm Special Agent Rebecca Harding, FBI. This is Special Agent Chen. We need to speak with you about an incident that occurred this morning at Lou's family diner. Smith forced a smile. The smile was one of his more useful tools. Big, disarming. The smile of a man who had nothing to hide, which he'd perfected over 9 years of having plenty to hide. Sure thing, agents. Though I have to say, sending federal officers out here for a little disturbance call seems like overkill. We handle our own business in Millbrook. We'll determine what constitutes overkill, Agent Harding said. Her voice was flat and even, like a road with nothing on it for miles. Is there somewhere private we can talk? Smith led them to his office, with his things, his desk, his diplomas, his photos, shaking hands with the county commissioner and the state representative and the governor once at a fundraiser in 2019. The arrangement of trophies that was supposed to communicate. I belong here. I have always belonged here. He sat behind his desk. They remained standing. Smith hated that. He was about to invite them to sit, to reassert some control over the room's geometry, when Agent Chen placed a tablet on the desk and pressed play. The video that appeared was crystal clear. The audio was crisp. There was Smith, in full uniform, grabbing an elderly woman and dragging her out of a diner. There was her face, twisted in pain. There was her stumbling. There was the shove. The video ended. Smith opened his mouth to speak. Agent Harding spoke first. That's assault, she said flatly. That's deprivation of rights under color of law. That's a federal crime, Sheriff. Now wait a minute, Smith said, his voice rising. That woman was loitering. I have a right. You have a right to arrest someone following proper procedures. Agent Harding cut him off, and her tone didn't shift by a single degree. You do not have a right to physically abuse a 68-year-old woman who posed zero threat and was in fact a paying customer who had broken no law. There is no loitering ordinance that covers paid customers in private businesses, and even if there were, so physical removal without cause, warning, or due process is not an enforcement mechanism permitted under any statute we're aware of. According to who? According to 5 witnesses we've already interviewed. Smith felt something cold move through him. 5 witnesses. In the 2 hours since he'd driven to Hal's Tavern, 2 FBI agents had interviewed 5 witnesses. We also spoke with the diner owner and with the waitress who filmed this. Agent Chen opened a folder. We've also pulled your arrest records for the past 5 years. The cold feeling intensified. You have a pattern, Sheriff. 83% of your use of force incidents involve people of color. 91% of your loitering citations target black residents. You've been named in 17 complaints that were dismissed by your own department. We'll be looking at each of those dismissals. Smith's face had gone red. "This is a witch hunt. You can't just walk into my town." "This isn't your town," Agent Harding said. "It belongs to the 4,200 people who live in it, many of whom it appears you have spent 9 years systematically terrorizing. And you are not above the law. No one is." "I want my lawyer." "That's your right. We'll be here when you're ready." Agent Harding stepped back, and her voice, which had been flat and certain as pavement, softened by precisely 1 degree, not with sympathy, but with something that might have been the last courtesy she intended to extend. "I should inform you that we're opening an investigation into possible civil rights violations spanning your entire tenure as sheriff. We'll be interviewing other potential victims. We'll be examining every arrest you've made, every use of force you've documented or failed to document. We'll be looking at your department's financials. We'll be talking to former deputies who left the department." She stepped toward the door, then stopped and turned back, a gesture so practiced it had the quality of theater. "You're going to want that lawyer, Sheriff, because when we're done, you won't just lose your badge." She held his gaze without blinking. "You'll lose your freedom." Smith sat very still after they left. He could hear his own breathing. He could hear Deputy Lewis in the outer office, very pointedly doing nothing. For the first time in 9 years, for possibly the first time since he'd put on a badge, Ronald Smith understood what it felt like to be in a room that didn't belong to him. The investigation moved with the speed and force of a freight train, which was either gratifying or terrifying, depending on which side of the tracks you were standing on. Within 48 hours, the FBI had interviewed 23 Millbrook residents who came forward with their own stories of Sheriff Smith's abuse. The floodgates had opened, not with dramatic force, but with the quiet, cumulative weight of many people exhaling at once after a very long time of holding their breath. Federal agents weren't from Millbrook. They didn't answer to Smith. They couldn't be intimidated by losing a parking ticket processing arrangement or a business permit renewal. They were, in the most precise possible sense, outside the system Smith had spent 9 years building. And people talked. Deshaun Williams, 19, are described in quiet and careful detail being stopped on Archer Street while walking home from basketball practice, placed in cuffs for suspicious behavior. He'd been wearing a team jersey and carrying a gym bag, and driven to the station, where he'd been held in a cell for 12 hours without being permitted to call his family. He'd been 17 at the time. The arrest record showed a charge of obstruction that had been dropped, with no notation of the 12 hours of detention. Nobody had asked Deshaun about it since, because Deshaun had understood, the way young black men in small southern towns learn to understand certain things, that asking the wrong questions in the wrong places could make everything worse. Margaret Chen, aunt who'd run a dim sum restaurant in a converted house on Millbrook's east side for 11 years, the kind of place that became a beloved local institution through the slow alchemy of consistency and good food, and an owner who remembered regulars' orders, provided bank records showing monthly payments of $400, labeled in her books as local business consulting, to a shell company that traced, with moderate effort, back to Ronald Smith's cousin. The code violations that had necessitated this arrangement had been applied selectively. Her restaurant was inspected twice yearly, while the 3 white-owned restaurants on Main Street had not been inspected in a combined total of 14 years. 3 women came forward with accounts of sexual harassment during traffic stops. 2 of them had filed internal complaints years ago that had vanished into Smith's own filing cabinets. The 3rd had told no one because her husband's employment at the county road department was, she felt with reasonable certainty, contingent on her not making trouble. A former deputy named Marcus Reyes, who'd resigned from the department in 2021 and left town shortly after, drove up from Tallahassee to give a statement. He'd been a deputy for 3 years. He'd documented things he'd witnessed in a personal journal that he'd kept, because some part of him had understood that he was watching something that would eventually come to light, and he hadn't wanted to be the one who'd stayed silent and had nothing to show for it. The journal covered 14 months. It was 312 pages long. The FBI evidence technician who received it said that it was the most comprehensive piece of documentation she'd seen in a civil rights case in 17 years. Victor stayed in Millbrook for a week. He worked remotely, taking calls on the porch swing, reviewing classified briefings in his mother's spare bedroom with the door locked, and a mobile secure communications unit he'd had couriered from D.C. His office knew he was in Georgia and that he was handling a family matter, and they gave him the space because Victor was the kind of employee who generated enough goodwill in normal times to draw on heavily in unusual ones. But mostly, he was present. He sat with his mother. He drove her to church on Sunday and sat in the pew beside her and sang the hymns he'd grown up with and hadn't thought about in years. And when the pastor said a prayer for the community, for justice and healing, and without naming names, in the careful way of a man who'd learned the cost of naming names, Victor bowed his head with everyone else and felt something move through him that was too complicated to name. He went to Lou's diner for breakfast every morning and made a point of sitting in his mother's booth, ordering coffee and reading, daring anyone to say something about loitering. Nobody did. Lou, who'd lived with his cowardice for years and knew it, came to Victor's table on the third morning. He stood there for a moment with a coffee pot, and Victor looked up, and Lou said, "I should have done more. That morning, I should have done more." His voice was rough. Victor looked at him steadily. "You spoke up, or you told him to stop. And then I stood there when she went out the door." There was nothing to say to that was both honest and comforting. Victor offered him honesty. "She forgave you already. She's that kind of person. But what you're doing now, cooperating with the investigation, giving a formal statement, that's the more important thing." Lou nodded. He refilled Victor's coffee without being asked. It was, Victor thought, the smallest and most complete kind of penance. The town was changing in small ways that added up to something significant. People made eye contact in the grocery store. Conversations at the diner were louder, less guarded. Neighbors who'd been cautiously civil for years found themselves lingering on each other's porches. It was as if someone had turned up a dial that had been stuck at low for nearly a decade. Emma Bledsoe became, quietly and without entirely meaning to, something of a local figure. She'd been the one who recorded the video. People knew it. She hadn't sought recognition. She'd gone back to work the same afternoon and tried to carry on normally. But recognition found her anyway, in the form of people nodding differently at her, buying her extra coffee, stopping to say thank you in the grocery store with a weight to the words that made clear they weren't talking about anything she'd done at the cash register. On day 6, the grand jury returned indictments. Sheriff Ronald Smith was charged with 3 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law, 2 counts of assault, 1 count of extortion, and 1 count of obstruction of justice for the destruction of complaint records the FBI's IT forensics unit had recovered from the department's servers in fragmented but reconstructible form. Because Smith had deleted them, but hadn't understood that deletion isn't the same as erasure. He was arrested at his home at 6:47 in the morning by Agent Harding and 4 additional agents, because Agent Harding was precise about such things and had no intention of giving him time to prepare or call anyone or otherwise manage the situation. He came to the door in a bathrobe, and she presented the warrant and told him to get dressed. And he did. And he was led out of his own house in handcuffs as 2 of his neighbors watched from their driveways. His badge, that gleaming, a mirror-polished shield that had for 9 years functioned less as a symbol of service than as a weapon of control, was booked into evidence at the federal courthouse in Albany. The news trucks arrived the next day. The trial took place 4 months later in the federal courthouse in Savannah, far from Millbrook's sphere of influence, in a courtroom with oak paneling and fluorescent lighting, and the particular hushed quality of spaces where very important things are decided in very matter-of-fact ways. Catherine Carlock sat in the front row of the gallery every day of the trial. She wore her Sunday best. She brought a book and read it during recesses. She ate the lunch she packed each morning, a sandwich, an apple, tea, and a thermos, on a bench outside the courthouse. She was orderly and composed and present, and she did not look away from the proceedings, even when what was presented was difficult to hear. Victor sat beside her, having taken formal leave from work, cleared it with his deputy director, and driven back down from D.C. He would not have been anywhere else. The prosecution presented the video. The video, which had by this point been viewed by roughly 6 million people on various social media platforms, a fact that the defense had attempted to use as grounds for a change of venue and had failed, was presented in the courtroom on a large screen. And the jury, 12 people assembled from the wider district, watched it in silence. They presented 23 witnesses. Each account was precise and consistent and devastating in its specificity. The specific words used, the specific dates, the specific figures of money paid. Collective testimony like that, the prosecution's lead attorney told the jury in her closing argument, wasn't conspiracy. It was pattern. And pattern was truth. They presented bank records, arrest records, and the internal complaint documents that Smith had thought he'd destroyed. Marcus Reyes's journal was read into the record over 2 days, 312 pages. The courtroom was very quiet during those 2 days. Smith's attorney was competent and trying. He argued that his client had been serving his community in difficult circumstances, making tough calls in a small-town environment where resources were limited. He argued that the witnesses were biased by community grievances that long predated Smith's tenure. And he argued that the FBI investigation had been triggered by the personal connections of a private citizen, a reference to Victor that the prosecution objected to and the judge sustained, and therefore carried a taint of political motivation. He was making arguments for the record, which is what defense attorneys do when the case isn't going their way, because the case wasn't going his way. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 14 minutes. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom was quiet when the verdict was read. There was no cheering. People exhaled. A few people in the gallery wept quietly. Catherine sat very still and nodded once, as if confirming something she had known for a very long time. The judge, a black woman in her 60s named Olivia Thornton, a woman who had grown up in rural Georgia, and who had driven 45 minutes each way to a better high school because the one in her town had been inadequate in ways that were not accidental, who had put herself through college and law school through an accumulation of scholarships and night jobs and sheer forward motion, looked down at Smith over her reading glasses. The courtroom was very quiet. "Mr. Smith," Judge Thornton said, "you were given a sacred trust. You were given a badge and the authority to protect and serve your community. That trust is not a small thing. It is extended by the public with the understanding that those who carry it will honor it, that the law, in their hands, will be applied with fairness and restraint and equal regard for every person it touches." She paused. She looked at him for a long moment. "Instead, you used that authority to brutalize, so to extort and to terrorize the very people you swore to protect. You targeted the vulnerable. You silenced the victims. You destroyed documentation specifically to prevent accountability. And you did it all. The evidence makes this abundantly clear, believing you would never face consequences." She removed her reading glasses. "You were wrong." She sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison. Smith showed no emotion as he was led away. The shackles made a sound as they clicked into place. It was a small, metallic sound, entirely without drama. He walked out of the room between 2 marshals without looking back. Catherine watched him go. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just nodded. That same quiet nod. The nod of recognition and acknowledgement and something that was neither victory nor relief, but existed in the more complicated territory between them. Something like equilibrium restored. Outside the courthouse, in the afternoon sun, Victor stood beside his mother on the broad stone steps. The news crews were there, not as many as there had been at the height of the story, when the arrest had generated a week of national coverage, but enough to make the day feel witnessed. Catherine declined to speak to the cameras. She'd declined consistently throughout. She was not a woman who sought the spotlight. She had sought, simply, for what had happened to her, to be treated as what it was. Emma Bledsoe was there too. She'd driven down from Millbrook with Lou and 2 others, a small caravan that had left before dawn. She and Catherine embraced on the courthouse steps. Emma was crying. Catherine wasn't, but she held the young woman for a long time, and when she pulled back, she held Emma's face in her hands for a moment, the way she might have held her own daughter's face had she had a daughter, and said something quiet that Victor couldn't hear. He didn't need to hear it. He could see what it was. 1 year later, Millbrook looked different. Not dramatically different. Not transformed. Not unrecognizable. The pine trees were the same. The main street had the same businesses in the same buildings, with the same faded awnings. The diner still smelled of bacon and coffee. Transformation at that scale takes generations, and nobody was pretending otherwise. But something had shifted in the way the town held itself. The new sheriff was a woman named Angela Reeves, recruited from Atlanta with a mandate that came from the county board, which had reconstituted itself in the wake of the Smith investigation, with 4 new members and a suddenly renewed interest in transparency. Reeves was 38, methodical, and had the manner of someone who had thought carefully about every aspect of her job and intended to continue thinking carefully about it. She'd instituted body cameras in her first week, a civilian oversight board in her second, a formal community relations program, actual meetings, actual feedback, actual follow-up in her first month. It was not magic. There were deputies who chafed under the new regime. There were community members whose distrust ran so deep that Reeves's gestures of transparency read as performance. Healing of that kind doesn't arrive on a schedule. But the meetings happened. The cameras rolled. The complaints were received and tracked and answered by people who were not the people being complained about. It was a beginning. Lou's diner had been renovated with money from a settlement the town had paid to Smith's victims, a process that had been contentious because several members of the town council had initially argued that the settlement would bankrupt the municipality, until the attorneys representing the victims made clear that the alternative was a civil trial that would cost considerably more. The vinyl booths were replaced with new ones, still red, still vinyl, but without the duct tape. The floors were refinished. The ceiling tiles were replaced. New lighting, warm and soft, and replaced the harsh fluorescent panels that had given the diner for 30 years the ambiance of a police interrogation. Lou had commissioned a small plaque, bronze, installed near the front door. It read, "In recognition of the courage of Catherine Carlock and all who stood up for justice, this table is yours." The table referenced was her booth, Booth 4, near the window, with the view of the street and the Presbyterian church. It had been updated like the rest, but it was specifically and deliberately hers. The plaque said so. Catherine still came to the diner every Thursday morning. She sat in her usual spot, now freshly refurbished, and read her books and drank her coffee for as long as she wanted. She was currently working through a collection of James Baldwin's essays that Victor had sent her for Christmas. She was taking her time with it. Nobody bothered her. What had changed was both small and enormous. She occupied her corner of the diner without calculation, without the constant low-level arithmetic of how much space she was permitted to take up, how long she was permitted to stay, whether her presence there might be read as provocation by someone with the power to make her pay for it. She was simply there. She finished her coffee at the pace that suited her. She turned her pages in the morning light. It was, she had told Victor on the phone, one of the best feelings she'd ever had. He had not been surprised to hear that, and he'd sat with it for a long time after they hung up, thinking about what it meant that so simple a thing, being let alone, being permitted to exist in a public space without fear, could feel like such a profound gift. Von Emma Bledsoe had been promoted to shift supervisor at the diner. She'd also enrolled in community college, starting with 2 classes, criminology and communications, on a schedule built around her diner shifts. She'd been, in the months since the trial, contacted by 2 civil rights organizations that had seen the story and were interested in her account of what it had felt like to be the one with the phone, standing near the kitchen door, making the decision she'd made. She'd spoken to them carefully and thoughtfully because she was 23 now and had learned something about being careful and thoughtful. What she told them when they asked about the moment of decision was that she hadn't known what would happen. She hadn't had a plan. She just had a phone and a conviction that what she was seeing was wrong, and she hadn't been able to make herself put the phone away. "I thought about what would happen if I sent that video, and it didn't matter," she said, in an interview that was later quoted in an article about civil rights accountability. "And then I thought about what would happen if I didn't send it, and it did matter." And those 2 possibilities felt very different. Victor visited more often now, every 6 weeks roughly, sometimes more. He drove down on Friday evenings and left Sunday afternoons, and they spent the weekends in the quiet rhythms of a life he'd spent 20 years keeping at arm's length. Saturday mornings at the garden center, picking out things she was considering for the spring beds. On Sunday services at the church, where he'd been baptized 39 years ago, and whose congregation received him now with a warmth that felt like returning somewhere you hadn't known you'd missed. Long evenings on the porch swing, talking or not talking. The Georgia dark full of stars that weren't visible in Washington. The porch swing still held. The hardware his father had drilled into the eave held 2 adults and the weight of everything that had happened. Victor thought about that sometimes, about the things his father had built that endured. He'd been a construction worker, Thomas Carlock, a man who worked with his hands and thought carefully about load-bearing and structural integrity. He'd never wanted his son to work with his hands for money. He'd made that clear. But he'd also taught Victor, by example and occasionally by explicit instruction, that the things worth doing were worth doing with attention and care. Victor thought his father would have had something pithy and accurate to say about all of it. He missed him with a specific, irresolvable ache, the kind that doesn't decrease with time so much as become incorporated into the self. In a federal prison in South Carolina, former Sheriff Ronald Smith had learned, in the way that men who have spent their lives controlling others eventually learn when control is taken from them, the precise dimensions of powerlessness. His cell was 8 by 10 feet. His days were structured by someone else's schedule. The men around him did not defer to him, and those who learned who he'd been regarded him with the particular contempt that corrections officers and their charges reserve for law enforcement. There was a poetry in that he was unequipped to appreciate. He had filed 2 appeals. Both had been denied. He would be 64 years old when he was released, assuming good behavior that nothing in his character suggested was forthcoming. On a warm October morning, exactly 1 year after the assault, Victor sat across from his mother in that booth, both of them with coffee. The morning light coming through the window in long gold slants the way it does in October. The particular quality of fall light that makes everything look like it's being painted. "You ever regret it?" Victor asked. "Letting me call in the cavalry." Catherine looked at him with those wise, unsteady eyes that had always seen him more clearly than he saw himself. "Baby, I didn't let you do anything. You did what sons do. You protected your mama. A lot of people got hurt in the investigation. lost jobs, families torn apart. Smith's people who made choices about whose side they were on. Catherine held her coffee cup in both hands and considered this. I don't celebrate their trouble, but I don't carry it either. They made their choices. And a lot of people got freed, Victor said, echoing something she'd said to him months ago. That town was suffocating. Catherine's gaze moved to the window, to the street outside, where a young woman was pushing a stroller and a couple of men were talking on the corner in the relaxed way of men who aren't watching for trouble. Smith was suffocating it, and sometimes you have to burn down the rot to let new things grow. Victor smiled. You sound like a revolutionary. I'm a mother, Catherine said. She looked back at him. Same thing, really. Outside, Millbrook went about its business. People walked dogs. Kids rode bikes. The sun lit the street in that warm October way, and the town that fear had built was learning. Slowly and imperfectly, and with all the difficulty that real learning requires, what it meant to be something else. Justice hadn't been easy. It hadn't been fast. It hadn't arrived on its own. It had required a 22-year-old with a phone and a 70-year-old woman with dignity, and a son who understood exactly how the machinery of accountability worked and was willing to use it. But it had been absolute. Because sometimes the people you underestimate have the strongest allies. And sometimes the badge doesn't protect you. Sometimes it just marks you as the criminal you always were. And sometimes the son your mother raised is exactly the person that the moment requires.